Today, we're tackling one of the biggest questions of all. Does God exist? We're going to break down the arguments from a personal blog called HiberniaGospel and really dig into their unique perspective on this.
This is a question that people have asked for, well, forever. But the blog we're looking at today doesn't just throw the question out there. Nope, it actually tries to build a case, to lay out a reasoned path to an answer. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to walk that path together, step by step.
All right, here's the game plan. First, we'll look at the ultimate question itself. Then we'll get into the whole doubt versus decision thing. After that, we dive into the evidence, creation, our inner compass, morality, and miracles. And we'll wrap it all up with the author's final invitation to believe.
Okay, first step, the ultimate question. So why do we even ask this stuff? Well, the author, who's writing from an Irish point of view, actually thinks questioning our beliefs is a good thing. It's totally natural. It's really the first step in making a belief your own, instead of just, inheriting it.
And right at the start, the author sets a really important ground rule. They argue that if God does exist, then he's the one who decides what kind of evidence we get. So the idea here is we can't go in demanding some kind of cast iron proof. The challenge is to just be open to the evidence that's on the table, even if it's not what we were expecting.
Okay, that leads us right into this philosophical fork in the road. The article really pushes on this point. Should we just live in a state of constant doubt forever? Or does there come a time when you just have to make a decision, one way or another?
To illustrate this, the source brings up the philosopher René Descartes. You've probably heard his famous line, "I think, therefore I am." He basically tried to doubt absolutely everything he could. And what did he find? The only thing he couldn't possibly doubt was the fact that he was doubting, that he was thinking. The author's point here is pretty clear. If you take doubt to its extreme, you might end up with nothing left to believe in at all.
So, what about the other options? Well, the author describes atheism as being pretty cold and final, and agnosticism? That's seen as sitting on the fence. But here's the kicker. The author argues that sitting on the fence, doing nothing, is still a choice, and it might not be the safest or best one to make.
And to really hammer home this idea of making an active choice, the author brings in this quote from the Bible about the narrow gate. The point isn't just to drift along, but to make a conscious, active decision to find and walk a specific path, even if it's the one less traveled. All right, so if you have to make a decision, what's it based on? Well, the author lays out what they call 5 strands of evidence. Think of them as 5 different lines of reasoning that, in their view, all weave together to build a compelling case. We're talking about everything from our own inner feelings to the universe itself, morality, and even a specific person in history.
Let's dive into those first 3 strands of evidence. These are all about finding clues, both by looking out at the world around us and by looking inside ourselves.
The first strand is what the author calls our appetite for God. It's a really intuitive idea. They compare our belief in God to a newborn baby's instinct to cry for milk. It's something that's just wired into us, a kind of spiritual hunger. And the argument is that this is our default setting, and we actually have to work to suppress it.
Okay, strand number 2 is a classic philosophical argument called the uncaused cause. It's pretty simple when you break it down. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? A leads to B, B leads to C. Well, if you follow that chain all the way back, the universe itself must have had a cause. Something had to kick the whole thing off. The author argues it makes more sense for that first cause to be a personal creator rather than just some random impersonal event.
Then we have the third strand, the argument from design. The idea here is that the universe doesn't just exist, it seems perfectly fine-tuned for life to exist. The source uses this incredible analogy to make the point. The odds of our universe just popping into existence by chance are like one person winning the lottery 10 weeks in a row. I mean, after the second or third week, you'd start to think the game is rigged, right? You wouldn't just say, wow, what a coincidence.
And to really land this point, the author brings up a fascinating example, Dr. Anthony Flew. Now, this guy was one of the world's most famous atheists for decades, but late in his life, he changed his mind. Why? He said the sheer, mind-boggling complexity of life and nature couldn't be explained by chance. He concluded that a superintelligence had to be the only good explanation.
Okay, so we've looked at the cosmos. Now, for the last 2 strands of evidence, we're shifting our focus to something much more personal, the human element. We're talking about our minds, our sense of right and wrong, and a specific claim from history.
The fourth strand, mind and morality, starts with a really tough subject, the existence of pure evil. The author brings up the horrific Beslan school massacre from 2004, not to be shocking, but to ask a really deep question about why we all feel that same sense of outrage.
And this is the core of the question. If we're all just, accidents of evolution, just atoms and matter bumping into each other, then how can we possibly say that anything is absolutely wrong? Where does that feeling come from? Is something like the Beslan massacre just an opinion? Or does our shared sense of evil point to something real and absolute? So the author's conclusion here is that our consciousness, our inner world, and our built-in sense of right and wrong are just fundamentally different from physical stuff like atoms. And if that's true, they argue it points away from random chance and towards a great mind, a moral lawgiver who put that compass inside us. And that brings us to the fifth and final strand of evidence, which the author presents as the peak of their argument. We're moving from philosophy and science now to a specific claim from history centered on the person of Jesus Christ, and it's all summed up in this one famous verse. So the core of this historical claim is the resurrection. And the author really zooms in on one detail from the biblical account that after he was crucified, Jesus was apparently seen alive by over 500 people at the same time. The point they're making is that this wasn't some private, one-on-one vision. It was presented as a massive, public event with hundreds of eyewitnesses. Then the author backs this up with a logical puzzle about the disciples. Most of them died horrible deaths for saying they saw Jesus alive. And here's the question they pose. Look, people will die for something they believe is true, but would you die for something you knew was a lie, a story you and your friends made up? The author presents their willingness to die as powerful evidence that they genuinely believed what they saw. So that's it. Those are the 5 strands of evidence the author weaves together. You have the appetite for God, the uncaused cause, the design of the universe, our sense of morality, and finally the historical claims about Jesus. And after all that, the conclusion isn't a QED like in a math problem. It's something different. It's an invitation. All right, let's just quickly recap the key takeaways from this perspective. First, belief in God is presented as our natural default setting. Second, doubt is okay for a while, but eventually you have to make a decision. Third, there's evidence all around us, in nature, in reason, and in history. And finally, for this author, the ultimate revelation is Jesus Christ. And that's really where the author leaves us. They presented their case, pulling from intuition, philosophy, science, and history. They've laid out the evidence as they see it, and now the final thought isn't an answer. It's a question aimed right back at the reader and at you. The evidence has been presented. The decision is yours.